They told him that he would never succeed. They closed doors in front of him, burned his dreams to ashes, but he didn't break down. This is the story of how one man turned pain into a legacy that no one can erase through racial discrimination. Miguel, a young man from the sun-scorched plains of Jalisco, Mexico, had always dreamed of something more. As a child, he would listen to the elders in his village talk about the promise of America, the land of opportunities, where hard work could turn dreams into reality. With the blessing of his parents, he left behind the comforting rhythm of life in the small town to chase that dream. But when he arrived in Los Angeles, the bright lights of the city didn't seem so welcoming. His first days in the country were a blur of overwhelming noise, unfamiliar faces, and the heavy weight of a language he could barely speak. His accent, thick and unpolished, was an immediate target for mockery. Every word he spoke seemed to draw sneers, and every glance he caught in the street was one filled with skepticism or disdain. He spent the first year barely surviving, taking on odd jobs as a dishwasher, a janitor, anything that would pay him enough to stay afloat. But it was during those hours of scrubbing dishes in the back of a dimly lit restaurant that Miguel realized something crucial. He was not going to make it by being invisible. He needed to be seen. He needed to prove that his worth wasn't determined by the color of his skin or the accent in his voice. He was determined to build a future that would give him the respect he knew he deserved. In his small, cramped apartment, he spent countless nights studying English, practicing words he had heard over and over, teaching himself grammar with an old dictionary and the help of online videos. It was exhausting, but with every new word he learned, his confidence grew. He also began to learn about business, the kind of business that could allow him to stand on his own 2 feet. The idea came to him like a spark in the dark. He would open a restaurant. He knew food. The flavors of his homeland were embedded in his soul. And so, he started saving every penny he could. His dreams took root in the form of a small food cart he bought with what little money he had saved. It wasn't much, but it was his. It was his first taste of independence. He parked the cart on a busy street corner, hoping to attract customers who wanted something other than the bland, fast food offered by the nearby chains. At first, it was slow. People walked by, eyeing the cart with suspicion, unsure of what it was. The barrier of language and culture made it even harder. The first few weeks, he barely sold a meal. He could see the look of judgment in the eyes of passers-by, a feeling he had grown accustomed to since childhood. It was the quiet racism that whispered in every interaction, telling him that he didn't belong. That his food, his accent, his very existence didn't belong in this city. One afternoon, an elderly white man stopped by the cart. He looked at the steaming tortillas filled with carne asada, the cilantro and lime, and raised an eyebrow. Miguel hesitated, unsure of what kind of reaction he'd get. "What is this?" the man asked, his voice curious but skeptical. "Tacos, sir," Miguel replied, his accent thick but determined. "From my country, Jalisco." The man paused, then ordered one. Miguel handed it to him with a nervous smile, but when the man took a bite, his eyes widened. "This," he said, his voice filled with surprise, "this is the best taco I've ever had." Miguel's heart swelled, but it was the man's next words that would change everything. "I work for a food distribution company. I can help you get supplies." That day, Miguel had his first real break, a connection that would change the course of his life. Over the years that followed, he faced one obstacle after another. He struggled with the banking system, which seemed built to shut out someone like him. He walked into banks with his dreams in his eyes, only to be turned away, told that his lack of credit history made him a poor risk. The system was set up in such a way that, no matter how hard he worked, he seemed destined to remain on the margins. He was told that his immigrant status made him a risk. His accent, his skin, his origins were all marks against him. But Miguel was no stranger to adversity. He knew what it was like to work in the shadows, to fight for every inch of space. So, he started working his way up, slowly, one loan at a time. He networked with other immigrants who shared his dreams. He found allies who believed in him, who saw beyond his accent and the color of his skin. He managed to get a small loan to open his first brick-and-mortar restaurant. It was a modest space, tucked away in a neighborhood that had been forgotten by most. But for Miguel, it was a kingdom, a place where he could build his future, brick by brick, flavor by flavor. The restaurant was a reflection of him, bold, rich, and full of heart. As the years went by, his business grew. But it wasn't just the tacos or the salsas that kept people coming back. It was the spirit of the place, the spirit of resilience, of fighting against the odds. But even with his success, the racism never truly left. It lingered in the little things, the sideways glances, the whispers behind his back, the assumptions that his food was too spicy or too unfamiliar. He'd faced it all before, and he would face it again. But this time, it didn't matter. He had built something that was his. A piece of the American dream that no one could take away. As the restaurant flourished, Miguel met Mariana, a fellow immigrant from Colombia, who had a quiet elegance about her. She worked as a waitress in one of the finer restaurants in town, serving food she could never afford to eat. They met one evening when Miguel was looking for new staff. Her eyes, warm and full of life, caught his attention immediately. He knew that look. She had the same hunger in her eyes, the same unspoken understanding of what it meant to struggle. The first time they spoke, it was over a plate of empanadas at his restaurant. She hesitated at first, unsure of the man who had built this place from the ground up. But as they talked, the barriers between them melted away. They both spoke of dreams, of families left behind, of struggles in foreign lands, of a future they were fighting for. Their connection grew as they spent hours together in the restaurant after hours, talking about the future, about the children they would someday have, about a life beyond the barriers that seemed to keep them at the edges of society. Miguel would cook her favorite dishes, dishes she had missed from her homeland, and with each meal, their bond grew stronger. There were moments, though, when the weight of their shared history hung heavy between them. The way people looked at them when they walked together, the way their love felt like an act of defiance in a world that seemed bent on keeping them apart. They were two souls bound together by their struggles, yet torn by the reality that the world still had so many barriers left to break. But even as they faced those harsh realities, there was hope. There was the promise of a future where their children would grow up in a world that recognized them for who they were, not where they came from. And so, as the restaurant became more successful, as their love deepened, and as Miguel continued to build his legacy, he knew one thing for certain. His success was not just his own. It was the culmination of every immigrant who had fought for a place in this land, a place where they could live and thrive. His triumph was a testament to the fact that, no matter how many walls are built around you, if you refuse to be broken, you will find a way to rise. But the fight wasn't over. There were still battles to be fought, battles that would test the very essence of their love, their business, and their future. Mariana became Miguel's anchor, the quiet force that steadied him when the weight of his past and the struggles of his present threatened to pull him under. She had her own ghosts, her own battles with discrimination and the ever-present fear that one misstep, one bad month, could send her dreams crumbling. They understood each other in ways no one else could. When she laughed, it was like something sacred, something stolen from the pain they had both endured and turned into music. They spent their nights together after the restaurant closed, sitting at the small wooden table in the dimly lit backroom, counting earnings, sharing stories, drinking cheap tequila from mismatched glasses. Sometimes Miguel would cook for her, not because she asked, but because he loved watching her close her eyes and savor every bite, the way she whispered his name when the flavors hit her tongue just right. It was in those stolen moments, away from the judgment of the world, that their love flourished. But the outside world was never far away. Success did not shield them from the sting of prejudice, from the way some customers still hesitated before stepping into his restaurant as if they were unsure if they belonged, from the city officials, who scrutinized his permits more than those of his competitors, from the bank managers who still spoke to him like a risk rather than an entrepreneur. The fight never ended. One evening, a well-dressed man in a suit stepped into the restaurant, surveying the space as if he owned it. He introduced himself as a real estate developer, a man with a cold smile and empty eyes. "I have an offer for you," he said, sliding a piece of paper across the counter. Miguel didn't need to read it to know what it was. They wanted his space. Wanted to tear down the restaurant, build something shinier, something without history, without soul. "Your kind of business doesn't last here," the man said, his voice carrying the quiet arrogance of someone who had never known hunger, never known fear. "Take the money. It's more than this place is worth." Miguel stared at him, his hands clenched beneath the counter. He thought of every hour he had spent building this dream, of every moment of humiliation, of struggle, of sacrifice. He thought of his mother's prayers back in Jalisco, of his father's hands worn down from labor, of the way his name had been mocked in schoolyards, in job interviews, in the halls of banks that never wanted to lend to him. "Get out," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The man smirked, as if he had expected as much. "Suit yourself," he said, slipping the paper back into his pocket. "But you'll regret it." The threats came in small ways at first. A surprise health inspection. A complaint about noise. A warning from the city about a zoning issue that had never been a problem before. The weight of it pressed on Miguel, but he refused to bend. "They can't take this from us," Mariana whispered to him one night, tracing her fingers along his jawline. "Not if we don't let them." But the pressure only grew. One evening, as Miguel locked up the restaurant, he saw the words scrawled in red spray paint across the front window. Asterisk, asterisk, go back home. Asterisk, asterisk, the sight of it sent a shiver down his spine, not from fear, but from the raw, seething anger that rose within him. He stood there for a long time, staring at the words, feeling the weight of every insult, every slight, every moment of dismissal that had led to this. When Mariana arrived a few minutes later, she found him still standing there, his fists clenched. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his, grounding him. "They don't get to define us," she said softly. The next morning, Miguel didn't call the police. He didn't clean the window. He left the words there for all to see. But beneath them, on a simple cardboard sign, he wrote in bold letters, asterisk, asterisk, we are home. Asterisk, asterisk, the picture went viral. Someone snapped a photo, posted it online, and within hours, the restaurant was flooded with support. Customers, old and new, poured in, people of every background, every walk of life, coming not just for the food but for the statement it made. Business boomed. The threats didn't stop, but Miguel no longer fought them alone. He had an army of supporters, of allies who saw his fight as their own. But not all battles could be won with resilience alone. Mariana had been sick for months, though she tried to hide it. At first, Miguel thought it was exhaustion, the long hours, the stress. But one night, as she washed dishes in the back, he saw her collapse, her body crumpling to the floor like a marionette with its strings cut. Panic surged through him as he rushed to her side, his hands trembling as he cradled her face, whispering her name over and over. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and cold, of something clinical and unforgiving. The doctor's words were a blur. Cancer, aggressive, treatment options. Miguel sat beside Mariana's bed, his hands wrapped around hers, feeling the calluses on her palms, the proof of every struggle they had endured together. "I'm not afraid," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just don't want to leave you alone." He pressed his forehead against hers, his tears hot against her skin. "You won't," he promised. "You never will." He poured everything into the restaurant, into making it something Mariana could be proud of, even as she grew weaker. She still came to sit at the back table, watching him cook, watching their dream thrive even as her body betrayed her. When the end came, it was quiet. Miguel held her as she slipped away, his heart shattering in silence. The grief was a living thing, clawing at his chest, threatening to consume him. But he kept going. He had to. For her. For every dream they had built together. The restaurant became a shrine to their love, to their fight. A framed photo of Mariana hung by the entrance, her smile frozen in time, welcoming every customer who walked through the door. Miguel cooked with a fire in his soul, pouring every ounce of love, of pain, of longing into every dish. And when people asked about the story behind the place, he told them. Because some stories deserve to be remembered. Because love, even in loss, even in struggle, even in the face of a world that tried to erase it, could still endure. Miguel's days blurred together after Mariana passed. The restaurant, once a vibrant reflection of their shared dream, now seemed like a hollow shell, each plate he served, each dish he prepared, a silent tribute to the woman he had lost. But he knew she wouldn't want him to give up, not after everything they had fought for. He couldn't afford to let grief swallow him whole, not when there were so many people who relied on the restaurant. It became his lifeline, his only anchor in a sea of sorrow. The evenings grew longer, the weight of loneliness settling like a heavy coat on his shoulders. But he carried on. For her and for the customers who came, their faces now as familiar as the ingredients he measured out every day. The city, the same city that had mocked him when he first arrived, now began to recognize him. His restaurant became a place of legend, a symbol not just of food but of resilience. Locals spoke of Miguel's tacos with reverence, often telling newcomers that no visit to the city was complete without a meal at his place. The walls, once bare, were now lined with photos, with notes, with mementos from those whose lives had been touched by the flavors and the story behind the food. And yet, the world still hadn't quite accepted him. The subtle racism still crept into his days, in the questions about his origins, in the assumptions people made about his work ethic, his skills, his worth. He remembered the days when he had struggled with the language, when every misstep had felt like a judgment, when his very presence had been questioned. Now, as he walked through the streets, he still felt that old sting, but it didn't affect him as much as it used to. He had built something no one could take away. There were moments, though, when the ghosts of his past came back to haunt him, like the day the developer returned, slick and confident, offering once again to buy him out, to turn the space into something modern, something profitable. But Miguel wasn't that same young man who had first opened his doors with nothing but hope in his heart. He had grown stronger. "I'm not selling," Miguel said firmly, standing tall across the polished desk in the developer's sleek office, his voice steady, unyielding. The man across from him gave a patronizing smile. "You can try to hold on to this dream, Miguel, but it's just a dream. Things change. The city's moving forward. You can't stay in the past." Miguel felt his pulse quicken, but his gaze didn't falter. "This place is the future," he said, his voice calm, but filled with an intensity that spoke volumes. "This restaurant, my story, the food, it's more than just a business. It's a testament to everything we built. You can't tear that down." The developer looked at him with something like pity in his eyes, but Miguel had long since stopped caring about what others thought. He had learned that the only way to break free from the walls built around him was to keep moving forward, to keep fighting, no matter how hard it got. Days turned into months, and the city began to change in ways Miguel hadn't expected. His restaurant had grown, and with it, his reputation. People came from all over, travelers and locals alike, eager to taste the tacos, the carnitas, the barbacoa, the dishes that had roots so deep in his heart, so embedded in his soul. They weren't just buying food, they were buying a piece of his journey, his pain, his love for a woman who had once stood by him, and a dream that had been forged in struggle. The restaurant had become a hub of sorts, a place for those who didn't quite fit in anywhere else. Immigrants, dreamers, rebels, those who had been told they didn't belong. Miguel made it a point to hire people who had been rejected by others, the ones who faced the same battles he had faced when he arrived, those who knew what it felt like to be invisible. It was more than just a business to him. It was a community, A family built from shared experience, from shared sacrifice. One day, as he worked in the kitchen, chopping onions and seasoning carne asada, a young man came in, his face weary but determined. He spoke in broken English, asking for a job. Miguel saw something in him, something familiar. The way his eyes held the weight of a history he hadn't yet been able to escape, the same fire that had once burned in Miguel when he first arrived in this country, not knowing the language, not knowing if he would ever find his place. "You don't have to speak perfect English to work here," Miguel said, his voice warm but firm. "You just have to work hard." The young man smiled, a little hesitant, but grateful. And so, he joined the kitchen staff, quickly becoming one of the hardest workers Miguel had ever known. But even as the business grew and more people came, there were still those who tried to tear him down, who wanted to see him fail. One night, as Miguel was closing up, he found the front door locked with a chain. His heart sank as he saw the police officer standing by, arms crossed, waiting. "What's going on?" Miguel asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "A zoning violation," the officer said curtly. "You've been operating past your permit hours. We've had complaints." Miguel's stomach dropped. He had always followed the rules. The papers, the permits, everything was in order. But it didn't matter. They were coming after him again. He stood tall, though, never showing the fear in his chest. "I'm sure it's a mistake," he said, though he already knew better. The officer just gave him a look, one that told him everything he needed to know. They were doing everything they could to break him, to make him bow to the systems that had long since refused to accept him. But Miguel wasn't the man he had once been. He wouldn't be broken. That night, after the officer left, Miguel stood outside the restaurant, staring up at the neon sign flickering above the door. The weight of it all pressed on him, but he refused to bend. He would fight, because that's what he had always done. For himself, for Mariana, for the dream they had shared. He wasn't going anywhere. The next day, he hired a lawyer, someone who had helped other immigrant businesses navigate the bureaucracy that was designed to crush them. The lawyer helped him file an appeal, find loopholes, and argue his case. The battle wasn't easy, but he had learned over the years that nothing worth having ever was. Days turned into weeks, then months, and Miguel's resolve only hardened. The restaurant thrived despite the hurdles, despite the obstacles. He had learned to navigate the labyrinth of bureaucracy, to fight for what was his. The city began to change, slowly but surely. His restaurant had become a symbol of resistance, a place where dreams that had been crushed in the shadows could come into the light. It was a sanctuary, a place for those who had been told no, who had been told they didn't belong. And still, even as his success grew, even as the barriers began to erode around him, Miguel carried the weight of the past with him every day, the memory of Mariana, the memory of the struggles that had made him who he was. He carried her in the way he cooked, in the way he treated his employees, in the way he fought for justice. And though the world had not fully accepted him, he had built a place that was his. A place where he belonged. Where they belonged. Miguel barely slept. The weight of everything pressed down on him, the past and the present colliding in ways that threatened to suffocate him. The restaurant had grown beyond anything he had imagined, but so had the forces working against him. The city had thrown another challenge at him, a sudden increase in property taxes, a bureaucratic move designed to squeeze him out. He knew the game they were playing. He had seen it before, the way developers and city officials worked together to clear out spaces like his, replacing them with high-end businesses that catered to wealthier crowds, people who didn't want to be reminded of the struggles that had built the city they now enjoyed. But Miguel refused to let them win. Every morning, he woke before the sun, stepping into the quiet of his restaurant before the world stirred, running his hands over the worn wooden counters, inhaling the scent of masa and slow-cooked meats that had seeped into the very walls. This place was more than bricks and mortar. It was a heartbeat, a story, a love letter to everything he and Mariana had fought for. And so he fought back. He hired an accountant, someone who understood the loopholes, the fine print, the ways to push back against a system designed to break people like him. He gathered the community, spoke to local journalists, told his story not just as a personal battle but as something bigger, a symbol of what was happening all over the city, to immigrant business owners who were being squeezed out of their own neighborhoods. The media picked it up. Suddenly, his restaurant wasn't just a place to eat, it was a battleground, a rallying cry. The customers came in droves, not just for the food, but for what it represented. People who had never set foot in his restaurant before now lined up around the block, eager to show support, to stand against the forces trying to erase him. Donations poured in, offers of legal help, volunteers willing to do whatever it took to keep his doors open. And yet, even as the tide seemed to turn in his favor, Miguel felt the darkness creeping in. The exhaustion. The loneliness. The overwhelming weight of fighting a battle that never seemed to end. Mariana's absence felt heavier than ever. He found himself talking to her in the quiet hours of the night, whispering his fears into the darkness, imagining what she would say if she were still here. Would she tell him to keep fighting? To let go? He didn't know. He only knew that he couldn't stop, not yet. Then came the fire. It started in the dead of night, a sudden explosion of heat and smoke that engulfed the back kitchen before anyone could react. Miguel got the call at 3 a.m, his phone vibrating against the nightstand like a distant alarm in a dream. When he arrived, the street was bathed in red and blue lights, the firefighters battling against the raging flames that devoured everything he had built. The smell of burning wood and grease and memories filled the air, choking him as he stood there, helpless, watching his life go up in smoke. Neighbors gathered in stunned silence, some crying, some whispering about whether it had been an accident or something worse. Miguel didn't have to wonder. He knew. This wasn't just fate. This was a message. A warning. The developers, the officials, the unseen hands pulling the strings, they had grown tired of waiting. They had decided to end the fight in the most brutal way possible. The investigation ruled it inconclusive, but Miguel knew better. The cameras had conveniently stopped working that night. No witnesses. No suspects. Just ashes and rubble where his dream had stood. And yet, as he stood there in the ruins of everything he had built, something inside him refused to break. The grief was suffocating, the rage unbearable, but beneath it all, there was something else. A spark, a quiet, unyielding defiance. They had taken his building, but they hadn't taken him. He wouldn't give them that. The next day, before the ashes had even cooled, he made his decision. He would rebuild. Not in the same place, they had won that battle, but somewhere new, somewhere bigger. He would take what they had done to him and turn it into something they could never erase. Word spread quickly. The community, the same people who had supported him before, rallied around him once more. Fundraisers, donations, investors, people he had never met reached out, offering to help, offering to stand with him. And through it all, he kept moving forward, driven not just by anger but by something deeper, something that had carried him through every hardship, every humiliation, every loss. The belief that he belonged. That he had earned his place. That no one, no matter how powerful, could take that from him. Months passed. The new restaurant began to take shape, rising from the ruins like something defiant, something immortal. The grand opening was unlike anything Miguel had ever seen. Hundreds of people, packed into the street, waiting to step inside, to taste the food, to be part of the story. And when he stepped into that kitchen for the first time, when he flipped the first tortilla on the griddle, he felt it, Mariana's presence, not as a ghost, but as something real, something woven into the very fabric of the place. She had never left. She had been with him all along, in every struggle, in every triumph, in every moment of doubt. And as he looked out at the crowded dining room, at the people who had fought beside him, at the life he had rebuilt from the ashes, he realized something. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The restaurant stood as a monument to everything Miguel had endured, every sacrifice, every wound, every whispered prayer that had carried him through the darkness. It was not just a place of business, but a testament to survival, a declaration that he, and all the people who had been told they didn't belong, were here to stay. On opening night, the line stretched down the block, a sea of faces, old friends, strangers, immigrants, journalists, students, families who had once been regulars at the old place, standing shoulder to shoulder as if their presence alone was an act of defiance. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of roasted chilies, slow-braised pork, fresh masa sizzling on the hot griddle. The walls bore murals now, painted by local artists, each one depicting a different story: field workers under the scorching sun, a mother cradling a sleeping child as she crossed a border, a young man standing before a kitchen fire, turning pain into something nourishing, something eternal. And at the very center of it all, just above the bar where Miguel now stood, was a portrait of Mariana, her smile frozen in time, her eyes watching over everything he had built. He ran his fingers along the edges of the frame, tracing the curve of her cheek, swallowing down the ache that never quite went away. "She would have loved this," a voice said beside him, soft yet firm. It was Hector, one of his oldest employees, a man who had been there since the beginning, who had worked alongside him through every hardship, who had held him up when grief had threatened to drown him. Miguel nodded but said nothing. Words felt too small for the weight of what he felt. Instead, he turned, stepping into the kitchen, where the sounds of knives against cutting boards, the rhythmic sizzle of meat meeting the heat, the laughter of his staff, all of it wove together into something beautiful, something that felt like music. He picked up a knife, joining them, his hands moving on instinct, slicing through tomatoes, onions, cilantro, each movement a ritual, a prayer, a way of keeping Mariana alive in the only way he knew how. The hours passed in a blur, order after order flying from the kitchen, the roar of conversation and clinking glasses filling the air like a celebration. And yet, amid the triumph, the ghosts still lingered, the scars of the past refusing to fade. He saw it in the cautious way his newer employees carried themselves, the ones who had come to him looking for work after being turned away elsewhere, the same way he had once been turned away. He saw it in the nervous glances some of them exchanged when customers asked where they were from, in the way they hesitated before answering, unsure if their truth would be met with kindness or suspicion. And Miguel understood, because that fear never truly left, no matter how much success you built around it. It was a part of him, woven into his skin, his history. But he had learned something over the years. Fear could be tempered, molded into something else, something stronger. It could be turned into resilience, into fire, into the kind of quiet, unshakable strength that no one could take away. And so, he made a promise to himself that night, standing in the heat of his kitchen, surrounded by the sounds of his people, his family, not just the one he was born into, but the one he had built, one meal at a time. He would never stop fighting. Not just for himself, but for them. For the ones who still struggled to be seen. For the ones whose voices had been silenced for too long. For the ones who had come before him, whose sacrifices had paved the road he now walked. And most of all, for Mariana. Because love, real love, didn't die. It transformed. It became something greater. It became legacy. The night wound down slowly, the crowd thinning, the last customers lingering over their drinks, reluctant to leave. Miguel stepped outside for a moment, inhaling the cool night air, the neon glow of his restaurant sign casting long shadows on the pavement. He looked up at the sky, the stars stretching endlessly above him, and for the first time in a long, long while, he felt something shift inside him. Not closure, because grief didn't work that way. But peace. A quiet understanding that he had done what he had set out to do, that he had turned pain into something lasting, something that would outlive him. And as he stood there, watching the lights flicker, feeling the weight of everything and nothing at once, he thought he heard it, a whisper, carried by the wind, soft and fleeting. His name. Spoken in the voice he had loved most. He closed his eyes, let it wash over him, let it fill the spaces she had left behind. Then he turned, walked back inside, and kept going. Because that's what he had always done. And that's what he would always do.